We're named RP3, Rail Pollution Protection Pittsburgh, because even on a good day, giant diesel train engines emit huge amounts of tiny invisible particulate matter, which gets in our lungs and causes or aggravates serious health issues. That's why we're part of the Breathe Project, working to improve air quality in our region. But we worry most about the inevitable bad day, when, not if, a hazmat train derails. We'll share here some little known facts which reveal the nature of a firm that has a substantial daily impact on our lives with an ever-present risk of catastrophe. I want to stress three things up front. First, we appreciate that rail transport of freight, including raw materials, finished goods, and toxic chemicals, is viewed by experts as being not just lower cost, but safer and better environmentally than moving the same goods by truck. We don't oppose shipping these things by rail. We do believe the industry has failed to act responsibly to regulate their operations, particularly for oil and other dangerous cargo. Much stronger and independent regulation and oversight by government is desperately needed. Second, though this effort started in Pittsburgh, things RP3 has discovered and the constructive change we lobby for are of vital interest to every railroad community in this country. Third, to legislators in the audience, we ask you to fight the eye roll reflex every time someone says railroads. You have more power than you think to protect your constituents from rail failures. The time is ripe for change at state and federal levels. We support legislation already proposed and believe even more can be done to force the industry to modernize and to radically improve operational safety. We have a lot of material and we'll move quickly. All sessions will be available online. You're watching oil moving through downtown. I shot this last week. You can see trains on these tracks 20 times every day. In the near future, 80 times per day. We'll start with some historical perspective on the industry and we'll focus on Norfolk Southern. We don't assume they're better or worse than other railroads, but they control the bulk of the freight in our region where we have the most experience. You've heard Norfolk Southern spent billions to buy back their own stock, slash their workforce, and uses precision scheduled railroading, a euphemism for doing more work with less equipment and staff. You've heard inspection times of rail cars have been reduced so staff barely have time to walk its length. Glenn will explain these things. I'll just say that they're all about profit, but they're also all recent developments. To understand the railroad mindset, we need to go further back to understand what I call Norfolk Southern's zero maintenance philosophy. Let's look at a rail bridge on the North Shore where the tracks pass over Merchant Street at the southwest corner of Allegheny Commons. The bridge dates from 1905 and was the first bridge in Norfolk Southern's PVCP, the Pittsburgh Vertical Clearance Project, to be rebuilt, completed last year. This is how the bridge looks today. Here's how it looked 2 years ago. Remember, this is the Vertical Clearance Project. So an important detail is that the tracks are above the road. There was never a constraint here on railcar height. We've never understood why this was part of the PVCP or why it was implemented before the rest. In 2018, the railroad hired engineers to assess the bridge, as you see it here, and decide whether it could be saved or must be replaced. Their pictures show a steel structure in advanced decay. The bright spots you see in the plate steel here are daylight shining through holes. This photo shows 100% section loss, which is technical talk for no metal here, can't support any load. When the engineers published their report, we were shocked to see one image in particular. It's not that we were surprised at the bridge condition. We visited the site, but the plain statement of what caused the serious damage was new to us. It's directly attributed to an accident in 1934. Though neither the railroad nor the engineering company told us, this was no small incident. we've learned that a passenger train belonging to the long-gone Pennsylvania Railroad jumped the track, crashing into the Clark Bar factory and an apartment building below the bridge. People died. Let's turn the clock back to February 26, 1934. You'll want to use to boost your volume for this clip.
Death rides the rail. Smashed cars tell a tragic story of the plunge of an express train from the Pittsburgh viaduct, taking 9 lives and injuring 37. One of the coaches tore into the side of the factory, while others landed near apartment houses, terrifying their occupants. The train, bound from Akron, was just entering the city at night when suddenly it jumped the track. This shows how passengers were crushed in their seats without warning. Only a few minutes away from the next station, their lives were snuffed out in a twinkling. In spite of every safeguard, fate took its toll.
Again, that's the very same bridge we've been looking at. This was national news. 9 died, 40 were injured. We don't trivialize the loss of life, the horrific injuries, or the property damage. Indeed, the potential for such calamity is why we're here. But the most important lesson for us today is that neither this railroad nor its successor, Norfolk Southern, ever saw fit to repair the structural damage, not even to paint the area to prevent further degradation. As we see throughout our region, rail infrastructure is typically allowed to deteriorate until it falls apart. Bridges needn't end this way. We'll take a quick look at 2. This is the McCulloch Bridge. Most call it 16th Street. It's 99 years old, and the photos tell the story. The city maintains it well. There are no obvious signs of age or wear. It looks like it could easily go another 99 years. It's really in great shape. Just a half-mile downriver, which you can see in this photo, looking over the railing of the McCulloch Bridge at the Fort Wayne Bridge next to the convention center. This is my personal nightmare bridge. It's the pivotal link between Norfolk Southern's Fort Wayne and Pittsburgh lines, connecting right through the heart of the city. The Fort Wayne is 118 years old, built in 1905. There are 2 types of aging that concern me. The first is the structural steel itself. There are holes, which you can see here, flaking horizontal metal at the base of these beams retains water. It seeps into the cracks. There's little or no protective paint. There are holes at the top here. There are holes at the bottom. This is the worst part. This is the bottom of a beam that has absorbed water, rusted, and it expands as it rusts. It flakes off and it loses most of its strength. Some of the decrepit metal looks quite artistic, and these scenes are visible throughout the bridge. This is one of the worst locations. It's directly opposite the convention center. The horizontal steel beams at the bottom of this concrete used to be straight. They're now sagging, and it looks like there's not much strength left in that structure. The second problem is the concrete support piers. This is one where what used to be wrought iron rebar has disintegrated completely. This was built, the original stone piers were built in 1854 and are themselves fine, but the bridge was raised in 1918 by order of the War Department. It was lifted several feet to allow taller boats to pass. The concrete is in terrible condition. The rebar is just falling apart. There's nothing left. I wouldn't bet on this structure lasting beyond next week. Back to Merchant Street. The engineers said what we expected them to say. We knew the railroad wanted to replace the bridge, not fix it. They cited extensive steel corrosion and said there were major safety concerns and risk to the traveling public, meaning people walking, cycling, and driving underneath. They also said current and future rail traffic depends on it. On the next page, they confess their real objective: to accommodate the expected substantial increase in freight demand for the next 25 years. Norfolk Southern wanted a new bridge to grow their business, and they wanted taxpayers to cover most of the cost. They needed it because they neglected the old one until it failed, yet the bill was handed to the public. One more point about maintenance. The engineers weighing repair versus replace argued that saving the bridge would mean taking care of it, like painting every 20 years, something the city always does and the railroad never does. I used to work for Rust-Oleum on the industrial side and climbed many water towers and walked many bridges, all made of steel. I never met a maintenance head who didn't understand that steel outdoors needs to be protected or who was bothered by a 20-year painting cycle. I wondered whether Norfolk Southern has so little regard for our city and region that they don't care how decrepit they make us look. Here, the rusted hulk of the Fort Wayne Bridge, just a few feet from the gleaming convention center. The answer is yes. Just last week, an ABC NewsHour featured RP3 on rail safety and focused on Pittsburgh. Asked about maintenance, Norfolk Southern replied, "Aesthetics do not determine structural integrity." So much for appearances. The rail bridges will never look as good as the city bridges. As for structural integrity, if and when Norfolk Southern shares engineering reports which establish and confirm reasonable safety margins, we'll back off this point. They've declined. The real reason the railroad wants to modify Pittsburgh bridges is to accommodate the expected substantial increase in freight demand through 2045. This chart shows multi-level car carriers in the center and stacked container cars on the right won't fit our existing infrastructure, hence the plan to raise bridges or lower tracks at 9 locations. To be clear, we understand all stakeholders signed off on the vertical clearance project and it's a done deal. That doesn't mean we think it was a good deal or understand why taxpayers funded improvements to make Norfolk Southern, which made $1.1 billion profit last quarter alone, with the existing height constraints, even more profitable. We're still allowed to make sure public monies are spent as intended. We can still observe that the only thing taxpayers will reap from this forced investment are more pollution, more noise, and more risk of an East Palestine event. We can even note that a respected columnist recently called for Governor Shapiro to take back the taxpayer money. Our reality is that the railroad will soon run more longer trains, taller and inherently less stable, right next to volatile oil trains on a zigzag route through our most densely populated neighborhoods, including the downtown business district and sports arenas. We're allowed to continue working to maximize safety and minimize risk, and we'll do so. Let's look at project costs. We can see a couple of things from the railroad's grant application. Bridge construction on the left seems definitive, but there are very round numbers on rehab, which accounts for 60% of the project. $5 million on the right, $10 million, $2 million for a total of 17. The project total at the bottom of $28,571,429, when multiplied by 70%, the taxpayer's share yields exactly $20 million. Now look at this subsequent budget after the PennDOT grant was approved. Bridge construction is down by $7,348,571, offset by bridge rehab up $8.5 million. Track rehab is reduced by $2.5 million, while other rail work is up $1,423,571. Somehow, with all these adjustments, the project total is the same, $28,571,429 to Norfolk Southern, with $20 million from taxpayers. My day job is in commercial construction. Half my customers are government agencies, and half those projects are for the Department of Defense. I routinely see bids on far larger, far more complex work. I personally believe this grant followed a different backwards process. Hypothetical conversation. Railroad, we'd like funding help on some construction. State, what's it going to cost? Railroad, how much have you got? State, 20 million. Railroad, we'll take it. How else could a cost projection multiplied by 70% consistently yield a taxpayer share of $20 million to the penny, even as many component costs sharply change? I don't suggest this was illegal or improper, but if I were Norfolk Southern, I'd sure use a different method. These construction costs are hard to accept at face value. That's money problem number one. Money problem number two isn't what you see here. The fact that the new bridge is called maintenance rather than new construction isn't of consequence. But remember that the Merchant Bridge is above the street and therefore has unlimited vertical clearance. It did not constrain the railroad from running double-stack trains, which makes it impossible to use that argument to justify government funds. Taxpayers are simply buying Norfolk Southern a new bridge for $8.5 million. Money problem number three. While oversimplified, Norfolk Southern's capital budgeting model looks like this to us. Step one, build a new bridge for $8.5 million, using Merchant Street as an example. Step two, collect a taxpayer subsidy of $5.9 million. Step three, spend nothing on bridge maintenance for a very long time. 117 years is the actual life of Merchant Street. The net cost of over $20,000 per year is absurdly low. But worse is steps 4 through 6. Do it all again when the last bridge dies of neglect. The last money problem is that 2 of the approved projects were rejected by local government. The boroughs said no thanks to new structures which were little used, and to avoid future expense, simply told the railroad to demolish them. Marked by red X's on the map, these 2 projects were budgeted at over $3 million. As demolition costs far less, we'd like to know where that $3 million went. Finally, here's how Norfolk Southern views its operations from a recent promotional campaign. And here's how I personally view the company's operations. And for all the lawyers in the audience, this is parody. Thank you. I'd like to focus on trust and Norfolk Southern's 6-point safety plan when I come back, but now have the pleasure of introducing Glenn Olcerst and Barbara Talerico, who founded RP3. They've been fighting to hold railroads accountable and to mitigate their negative impacts on our community for more than a decade. Glenn also serves as general counsel for RP3, has scored many notable victories in court, and lately serves as a very effective talking head on TV and radio.